Good morning, everyone. It's 10:30, so I think we'll get started. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the launch of Britain Talks Climate after what's been quite an intense year of research, analysis and engagement. We obviously didn't plan it this way, but this webinar is taking place shortly after the Prime Minister unveiled his 10-point plan, which is designed to deliver, in his own words, a green industrial revolution. Now, one of the boldest commitments is the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030. I know a number of you will have been actively working on this, so I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge what is a real game changer. Many of the other proposals and much of the money has previously been announced, but the programme does include a chunk of new investment, which is, I think, a good deal better than many of us may have expected. It's fast from over, but a quick look at where many influential UK newspapers were this time 5 years ago shows just how far we've come. I'm just going to paste that in the chat there. So my name is Jessie Nichols. I'm the communications lead for the UK programme of the European Climate Foundation. And for those of you who don't know what we do, we support the climate community in shaping the public debate and forging bold solutions through philanthropy. I will be chairing today's webinar with the excellent team at Climate Outreach. You're going to be introduced to the key findings of the study and we'll explain how you access and use them. We'll then take a short break before fielding questions, and I kindly ask that you put any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and add your name and organisation when you do. We'll then talk about next steps before wrapping up at midday. So first, I just wanted to explain the genesis of Britain Talks Climate, which really dates back to October last year. And at that point, we'd seen incredible momentum on public engagement throughout 2018 and 2019. Public activism had opened up political space like never before. Businesses were integrating climate into their core decision-making, and cultural groups were questioning our relationship with the planet in really very unique and new ways. I think it's fair to say that the climate crisis had become a firm part of mainstream media and politics in the UK. But you know as well as I do that as a really critical decade gets underway for curbing our emissions, there is still a big policy gap between what the UK has promised to do and what we're actually on track to achieve. We're also seeing organised opposition to specific policies we need to get to net zero, and perhaps even more troubling attempts to politicise climate change as part of a wider culture war. And of course, it's not difficult to imagine how the COVID-19 crisis could send the world down an even darker path. So with COP26 on the horizon, we saw an opportunity to really capture the growing social mandate for climate action in a way that could be used to help maintain and strengthen political consensus. But we also saw an emerging risk that as we push for more and more difficult political decisions to be made, we could actually lose some of that hard-won support unless our communications and campaigns are much more reflective of today's society. So that's why we decided to team up with More in Common, who pioneered what they call their core beliefs model. And this is based on social psychology, and it uses measures on things like ideology, group identity and moral values, which are fairly unlikely to change over an individual's lifetime, to really get to know what sits behind public perceptions on issues like climate change. Together, we brought YouGov on board to help us carry out the fieldwork. And it was at that point I realised that we really needed an expert in climate change communications to develop a shared strategic understanding of the British public that we can learn from as a sector and take forward in really practical ways. And so Climate Outreach also joined the collaboration. Britain Talks Climate is the result of that work. It teaches us that COVID has thrown many people into the present and given them a real sense of immediacy and, crucially, a real desire for change. But it also teaches us that to bring about that change, many different roles and identities must come into play. The activist, the pragmatist, the patriot, the traditionalist and the liberal, all of whom you'll meet today. You may have seen lots of commentary over the weekend suggesting that the Prime Minister's decision to announce his new climate plan is part of a a woke agenda that will put off voters in former Labour heartlands. Now, our research shows that this simply isn't true, and it should give confidence to all politicians that no matter how old a person is, which political party they vote for, where they live, or how much they earn, the vast majority of Brits welcome bolder action on climate. But this action needs to be designed in a way that is fair and, importantly, is perceived to be fair. And it needs to be communicated in a way that fits with different groups' visions of what a good society should look like. And for some, this means talking about it in a way that really doesn't lead with the climate. But you'll hear more about that later. Before I hand over to Jamie Clark, who is Executive Director of Climate Outreach, I just want to really thank the teams at More in Common and YouGov, who have been just incredible partners on the fieldwork, and also our advisory group, which was made up of individuals from 17 organisations who have been, very generously feeding back at key stages throughout this year-long process. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Jessie, and thanks everyone for joining online and in the future when you look at this. So for me, the starting point of this project dates back a number of years. As an organisation that specialises in the application of the social science of climate change, it was becoming increasingly clear that there was a real need to actively understand how different parts of our society relate to climate change, so that climate advocates could more genuinely connect with those outside of our bubble. We've had a mixed track record in the UK and globally in doing so, but it has become increasingly clear that we are not going to achieve the rapid societal changes needed to address climate change without the consent and participation of citizens. We've seen climate policies and behaviour change initiatives failing across the world when the public hasn't been on board, whether it was the Gilets jaunes in France or the fuel duty protests here in the UK. But we've also seen that when the public gets behind action on climate change, dramatic political and behavioural shifts can and do happen. The government's 10-point climate change plan released today is full of ambition, but turning any such plan into reality will need strong and consistent public support across the country, not just amongst Guardian readers, but amongst communities that have been left behind, with communities whose identities feel threatened or disempowered by traditional climate change narratives. This project is more than just another survey of public attitudes, as useful as those may be. Britain Talks Climate is an evidence-based toolkit designed to support any organisation that wants to engage the British public on climate change. It offers a shared strategic understanding of the British public, and against a backdrop of growing concern about polarisation, it identifies effective ways to engage across the whole of society. What we're aiming to do in this project is to go beyond traditional divisions of left and right and focus on key communities of identity, listen to their perspectives, and understand how best to connect their concerns and values with the climate change issues, not ours. We are now doing what we specialise in at climate outreach, mobilising those understandings to support climate communicators to effectively engage wider communities through webinars and sessions like this, through the amazing interactive online guide that's now available, and I encourage you to check it out. And also we're establishing the Public Engagement Lab here in the UK for civil society actors in the run up to COP26 to utilise this and be supported to do so. At Climate Outreach, this has been a real team effort, and you'll be hearing from a number of our social scientists and communication experts in this session. So now I'll hand over to our lead researcher, Dr. Susie Wang. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. So I've started the slides. I hope everyone can see it, and I hope everyone can hear me. And just repeating some of the things in the chat, if you're struggling to hear, if you could find headphones, that would be great. Okay, I'll begin with the segmentation. So we began this research with a 10,000 person survey, including England, Wales, and Scotland. We also intended to get a North Island sample, but the panel was unable to get a good response. But as a result, we've tried to apply weights and quotas to make a relatively representative sample of Great Britain. We use cluster analysis to identify 7 segments based on a core set of behavioral and psychographic variables that you can see on the right. And this is based on the core beliefs model that Jessie mentioned from our research partners, More in Common. So from the top there, we have group identity and tribalism. So how strong your sense of group identity is, how dangerous you perceive the world to be, support for authoritarian leadership, core moral values such as fairness, loyalty, and care and harm, and whether you believe your position in life is in or outside of your control. So grouping people based on their responses to these questions leads to what we found to be a richer and more insightful breakdown of the different types of people in Great Britain than just demographics or political orientation variables. So after the segmentation, we conducted 35 interviews and 12 focus groups and repeated 2 waves of polling in May and September of this year, also to assess how COVID-19 had affected people's views on climate change. The 7 segments that we found are here. You can see them in the pie chart here, as well as the representation in the overall sample. So we found 2 ideological groups at the top. We have the progressive activists, who are very vocal and politically active and focused on climate change. And we also have the backbone conservatives, who are right-leaning, patriotic, and proud, and generally sort of less concerned about the activism that the progressive activists represent, and more about food and farming and preserving the countryside. So these 2 are defined strongly by their political views, but they're sort of separated by one being very far on the left, one being far on the right. The next 2 groups are the 2 disengaged groups. So you can see them in the orange and in the red. These 2 we also have a left-leaning one and a right-leaning one. The disengaged battlers are on the left, and they tend to feel unheard, and while they aspire towards an environmental Britain, they feel frustrated by what they see as environmentalism being a very middle-class thing. And the disengaged traditionalists are the right-leaning segment. They similarly feel alienated, but they're more skeptical of climate change, and of all segments are the least engaged on climate issues. So the disengaged groups in general tend to be of lower income backgrounds, have received lower educations, and also be of lower social grades. And the reason we've called them disengaged is because what they have in common is their low political and civic engagement. The next segment are the loyal nationals, and they are demographically similar to the previous 2, but with one crucial difference of that they are quite politically engaged, and that's because they feel galvanized by particular issues such as crime and immigration. And they are concerned mostly about localized environmental decline and inequality. And finally, we have 2 more groups who are less ideological than the progressive activists and backbone conservatives. Their politics are present, but they're softer. So the civic pragmatists are the pink, and established liberals are the sort of light green color. So the civic pragmatists are moderate. They're more likely to engage in, they're environmental, but they're more likely to engage in environmental activities at home rather than politically. And we have the established liberals, who are socially liberal, but economically conservative. They feel empowered and optimistic, and are engaged on issues such as low carbon solutions and growth. So that's a very quick overview. I will be going into each of these segments in more detail shortly. In terms of geography, segments are spread all across Great Britain, but there are a few differences. So you can see that London, for instance, in this orange, progressive activists are more likely to be in London. The backbone conservatives are more likely to be in the south. They're also more likely to be in rural areas, whereas the disengaged battlers are less likely to be based in the south and are more spread out in urban areas. And while it was a largely representative sample, ethnic minorities are underrepresented in the sample that we obtained ultimately, with 5% on average compared to around a 13% population average. And the people from ethnic minorities are more likely to be disengaged battlers, and they're less likely to be loyal nationals or backbone conservatives, likely related to the pro-British Empire attitudes characterizing these groups and anti-immigration views. So ethnic minority representation is a problem for many research panels, and one that needs correcting. And we're currently in a dialogue with the Market Research Society about industry standards and how ethnicity is factored into nationally representative samples in the UK. But what our extra focus groups and follow-up testing shows is that awareness of the intersections of climate and race are not well understood by the British public, and not even those from ethnic minority backgrounds, and may need some attention in order to approach this in a unified way. So the 7 segments have a lot in common in climate. The majority understand that it's happening and that we are convinced that we should do more about it. But there are important differences in the way that they engage with the issue. So now I'm going to go through each of the segments individually in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with the progressive activists. This is probably one of the most familiar groups. They're younger, they're on average, they're angry and they're passionate and politically active, but they're pessimistic about the direction that society has taken. The progressive activists use climate change as a lens through which to see all other social and political issues. And demographically, they're one of the segments with the higher incomes, they work in higher social grades, and also tend to have received higher levels of education. In terms of their worry about climate change, the progressive activists are the most worried of all segments. 93% are extremely or very worried. They also, I'm going to talk through these icons on the left, so one by one. So the first one is worry, the second is support for radical or urgent policies. And on this, the progressive activists strongly support radical action over gradual action. And 56% of them vote for a political party based on their climate change policies. But while they're strongly ideological and passionate about what they believe in, around 51% recognize that they can't drive change on their own and would still opt to compromise with other segments in order to get things done. So in this figure, what we asked them is whether they thought that the damage we're doing to the natural environment is exacerbating the spread and severity of diseases like coronavirus, or whether coronavirus is just a random and very unfortunate event that has no link to how people are changing the environment. And this was originally asked in May, and where you can see that the progressive activists are kind of out on their own and seeing the connection between human activity and the spread of coronavirus, but the other segments are much more split and leaning slightly more towards it's just a random event. We asked this question again in September, and what's interesting is that you can see the left-leaning groups have shifted more towards the progressive activists, and the right-leaning groups have shifted away. So there's an indication that the right-leaning groups are even slightly less convinced in September of the link between COVID and climate. And so campaigns making this link should be aware that it's unlikely to resonate with most segments, and it's potentially a polarizing issue. In terms of recommendations for this segment, key to this group is to persuade them that it's not too late, that they can bring the rest of the British population along with them and build a social mandate to act on climate. What they need is the tools to widen the movement and to convince others in a way that unifies rather than puts people off or divides people. There's the opportunity to channel their energy constructively towards meaningful political engagement and conversations with MPs, for instance, or the community, rather than typical protest actions. And progressive activists are also likely to feel conflicted about COP26, for instance. While they want it to succeed, they might find it challenging to support a conservative government. So it's important to find a voice on COP26 that navigates this tension. And finally, in terms of the silver linings of COVID-19, the progressive activists were one of the segments that was most skeptical of an increased sense of togetherness and unity that the rest of Britain seems to have perceived as coming from COVID-19. So on to the next segment. This one is also potentially familiar, the backbone conservatives. They are staunchly conservative. They tend to be, on average, an older segment, and similar to the progressive activists, are relatively well off and have received higher education. They're also quite proud to be British and most likely to describe themselves as hardworking of all segments. They're not necessarily skeptical about climate change, but they resist the kind of green activism that the progressive activists represent, as evidenced by this particular quote, where this backbone conservative says, "I wouldn't try and preach to anybody about it because I don't really think that's my right." So among this segment, 33% are unsure of the human causes of climate change. And as with other work on conservatives, are generally in favor of gradual, stable policies rather than urgent radical action on climate change. with only 38% supporting radical change. And similarly, only 4% would vote for a political party based on climate change issues. But what comes across strongly with this segment is the desire to preserve the British countryside. So the background conservatives are more likely to live in rural areas, and they show enthusiasm and openness to the broader goal of living more lightly on the land, preserving rural life, supporting farmers living in a more pro-environmental way. So you can see in this figure, their willingness to reduce, recycle, buy local foods, reduce food waste, and reduce electricity waste are higher than average, and in some cases approaching progressive activists who are generally on the highest end of all of these actions. So supporting British farmers, buying local, reducing food waste might be a route towards to reaching this segment on climate change. So in terms of recommendations for this segment has a story on climate change that is clearly distinct from the left. So we can build on well-established research, for instance, in the past on engaging conservatives on climate change, on emphasizing the things that background conservatives care about: British leadership, rural way of life, farming, and environmental standards. But importantly, it needs to be distinct from the left. It needs to come from a different messenger. So for instance, scientists and farmers, people impacted by climate change, are more trusted on climate change. And similarly, national pride is one thing that defines this group. And so emphasizing the practical achievements of Britain and British leadership, and what is going well is better than emphasizing what is not going quite so well. And while there are still some challenges, there's quite a lot of resistance towards things like a meat tax or reducing meat and dairy. That will change over time, and potentially with buy-in. So next we have the Civic pragmatists. So this is a moderate group that's both progressive socially and economically. They're more likely on average to be women than men, and they tend to have medium to high income and medium to high levels of education. So the Civic pragmatists are quite fearful about the direction that the world is taking, and they're worried about climate change. But it's not central to their politics. They're also proud of embracing diversity and advancements in gender equality in the country. And they're not as politically engaged on climate as progressive activists, and they're much more likely to try to do household-based things and speak to their family about climate change, for instance. Still, around 73% are very or extremely worried about climate change, with 69% supporting radical action. They are also reasonably open to ethical food consumption, eating seasonally and locally. But as you can see by this last icon here, only 15% of them would vote based on a political party's climate policies. And this and the wider lack of political engagement on climate change may be due to them being more likely than average to say that politicians don't care about people like them. They also differ quite substantially from progressive activists in that, for instance here, coronavirus is a national emergency, and we must put all issues on the back burner to deal with it, including climate change, is on the left, and on the right we have, but we shouldn't forget about other emergencies and make sure we're tackling climate change at the same time. You can see that the progressive activists are quite strong in their agreement with the statement on the right, but the Civic pragmatists show less agreement on this. And in terms of recommendations for Civic pragmatists, this segment has both the means and the motivation to take impactful actions themselves, but they tend to have low political and also personal efficacy on climate change. So in terms of personal efficacy, Civic pragmatists, for instance, regularly give to charity, and they also engage in a range of personal low carbon behaviors already. So if they can be persuaded to recognize that they're already activists in their own way in their personal lives, then that can build confidence with this segment. And similarly, politically, there's also a role for them. This segment can be a moderate voice in climate politics, with themes such as restoring balance and a sense of unity and drawing people together on climate change. They can also potentially be in a coalition on food, farming, and preserving the British countryside. And finally, while climate change is not necessarily their primary concern above all else, linking climate change to other issues that they care about, maybe effective way of holding their attention. So next we have the established liberals. This segment are internationalists who are the most optimistic of all of the segments. They're socially liberal, so they're also proud of Britain's diversity. But what distinguishes them from the Civic pragmatists is that they're economically conservative, so they support austerity and other measures. While they want positive progress on climate change to continue, they are more likely to be persuaded by economic arguments. So as I mentioned, they're one of the most optimistic segments. They're the least likely to agree that the country is getting worse, and they have a generally untroubled perspective. So they also feel the most politically empowered of all segments. They're more likely than average to feel part of a community, to feel like they have a say and that people can be trusted. So they also on COVID-19, as you can see in this quote, they take a positive spin on what's happened in society. So 61% of this segment are very or extremely worried about climate change, similar to Civic pragmatists. Only around 13% would vote for a party based on their climate change policies. And what we see with this segment is that climate change is not an issue that incites activism in this group, potentially because they generally don't see climate change as affecting them personally, or that it requires an urgent response. But despite this, they're more willing than most to embrace more meaningful elements of low carbon lifestyles, such as reducing meat and dairy or becoming vegetarian. And the 29% figure that you see here might seem low, but it's actually on the higher end. I think it's the highest, second highest score of all of the segments. Established liberals are also slightly more comfortable than average, as you can see in this figure, of prioritizing climate change and the green recovery. So you can see that their support is higher than the backbone conservatives, still quite a bit lower than progressive activists in sort of investing in green industries. And what I mean, it's positive that it is above the other right-leaning segments, but it's by no means universal among this segment. So that's something that campaigns should be careful about. In terms of recommendations, the established liberals they're open-minded, they're tolerant, and they have a sense of efficacy and influence that suggests that they can play a strong role in bolstering the case for common sense low carbon solutions. And as they are one of the most positive and optimistic segments, it's important to tell an authentically positive and optimistic story. And it's likely to resonate better than a negative message about how terrible climate change impacts are. And similarly, the rational economics of climate change policies, framing green recovery as a return on investment, as the common sense thing to do, is a good way to approach the established liberals and a good starting point. This segment can also be part of a coalition of low carbon, local food and farming. Their desire to protect farmers' livelihoods and conserve the natural landscape suggests a useful coalition with the backbone conservatives and the civic pragmatists that I've mentioned earlier. So now moving on to the disengaged segments. We'll start with the disengaged battlers. So this is the more left-leaning disengaged segment. They are economically and socially left-leaning. So the battlers care about climate change, they care about social issues, diversity, but they mostly care about inequality. They generally feel unheard and unrepresented. They're most likely to live in urban areas and have received medium levels of education, but they tend to have lower incomes and also are the most likely of all segments to be unemployed. They also are the most likely to feel lonely and the least likely to feel part of a community. And as suggested by this quote, while they do care about climate change, they feel that inequality on this issue and other issues is a big problem. They don't feel like they can personally do much about it. So I'm going to scroll forward. While they want the UK to be environmentally friendly, their concern about climate change is still above average, but is at similar levels to the backbone conservatives. Around 34% didn't vote in the last general election, and that seems to be consistent across the local elections as well. And they're most likely of all segments to be worried about unemployment during lockdown. Even despite this, though, around 59% of them would support radical, urgent climate change action. So for disengaged battlers, climate change action needs to be fair and equitable. They are far more likely on average to say that there's one law for the rich and one for the poor. And a crucial difference between them and, as you can see there, the disengaged traditionalists, who are similarly financially unstable. So they're generally unpersuaded by rhetoric suggesting that they should do their bit, with second lowest engagement in personal actions to address climate change. And they are more likely to say that they're busy enough surviving from day to day without having to worry about climate change. So in terms of recommendations, with this group, it's important to build trust by really listening and showing in actions as well as visual communication how climate change will genuinely benefit people like them. They may be receptive to concepts such as just transition, but need to understand that it won't place an unfair burden on those without the means to affect change. And as I mentioned earlier, pushing a middle-class environmentalist lifestyle to this group won't work, and rightly so, because they are generally not doing the things that environmentalists tell people not to do. For this reason, it might be more fruitful to highlight what they are already doing. The disengaged battlers are among the least positive about feelings of solidarity that have come from COVID-19 and what other segments would have highlighted as positive changes, silver linings. And so, and generally face more economic instability the longer this goes on. So the silver linings messages may also not work particularly well for this segment. The next disengaged group is the disengaged traditionalists. They are the right-leaning group. They're more meritocratic, traditional, and also authoritarian. Many of them don't vote, but when they do, they tend to vote conservative. In general, they also feel alienated and disillusioned, but they also feel skeptical to some extent about climate change. So around 30% of this segment think that climate change is due to natural causes, and 30% didn't vote in the last general election. They are also, across all segments, the least likely to act on climate change personally, even for low effort, low impact activities such as recycling that are generally seen as quite normative. So while one of the lower earning segments, they have low support also for income redistribution policies or measures to protect the vulnerable. So for instance, this segment is about how coronavirus will leave the majority of the population worse off, with vulnerable people the hardest hit. Taxation needs to be fair, and those with the means should pay more to help those in need. And you can see that I've circled in this box the three groups that tend to be of lower income, and you can see that the disengaged traditionalists are much lower and also below average in their support for this statement. So despite tending to have lower income, and this group doesn't tend to see themselves as vulnerable and are generally resistant to messages about protecting vulnerable groups. And for recommendations for this group, as with the other right-leaning segments, messages leading with climate action are unlikely to land positively with this group. They generally have quite low trust for environmental charities, for instance, but by being conscious of their red flags, we can at least not further alienate them on climate change. Messages about acting on climate change are unlikely to resonate. Instead, it might be better to talk about manufacturing fit for the 21st century, building on Britain's proud industrial past, and also engaging around green jobs and a low carbon transition. And as mentioned earlier, disengaged traditionalists don't see themselves as vulnerable or as victims, preferring hard work over handouts, and so social justice messages won't necessarily land well on them. And they have low trust in general, but this is the beginning of the conversation with them. One thing that we've noticed is that their understanding of climate change has shifted since COVID-19. In September, we did some polling and some extra focus groups, and this segment seems to have become less cynical of the human influence on the environment as a result of the virus and also environmental changes that they've seen since lockdown. So now on to the final segment, the loyal nationals. So the loyal nationals are demographically similar to the previous two, as I mentioned earlier, but they are galvanized and angry and threatened. So they do have high political engagement. They're one of the older segments. They're most likely to describe themselves as working class as well. And they lean left economically, so they're anti-big business and economic redistribution, but they lean right on social issues. They are the closest segment to being populist and are very concerned about issues such as crime, terrorism, immigration, but also climate change. So perhaps surprisingly, they are the third most concerned about climate change overall, and they show relatively high support for radical rather than gradual action on climate change with 51%. And despite being of the lower earning segments on average, they also tend to support the more costly aspects of ethical consumption, eating locally, eating organic and sustainable foods, buying locally, and possibly due to their patriotism. Even so, they're more concerned about other issues, Brexit, immigration, crime, and so climate policies don't necessarily drive their voting behavior, with only 5% voting for a party based on climate change. So in this figure, you can see that the Loyal Nationals share some core values with the established Liberals and the background Conservatives around ending our throwaway culture, reducing waste, working together to protect the environment, based on sharing, not selfishness, community, not division, and also feeling proud when they do their bit on the environment. And in terms of recommendations, what's important here is to not endorse the prejudices that many in this segment have, for instance, linking anti-immigration views to climate change concern and climate migration. But it makes sense to try and build on their climate concern in this group. And the challenge is finding a way to do so that doesn't endorse or take advantage of their fears. The Loyal Nationals' concern about the environment is likely to be on the local side, so more about localized inequality and environmental decline in their local area, rather than global solidarity with those impacted by climate change. And so bringing them together on local climate impacts such as flooding and the severe heat waves is a starting point for this group. Similarly, their trust on climate change lies mostly on local and ordinary people, on farmers, friends and family, and people affected by flooding and other climate change impacts. And the segment also has a strong sense of fairness, that everyone must play by the rules. And so, and they also have a strong sense of victimhood, of being on the receiving end of unfairness. So calling out big polluters is one narrative that may work for this segment. So now I've gotten through all of the segments, I'm going to pass on to Adam, who's going to talk about some more strategic messages and overall takeaways.
Thanks so much, Susie, and hi everyone. It's really great to have such a large audience to talk about this project. So I'm Adam Corner, Programs and Research Director at Climate Outreach, and this Britain Talks Climate is such a rich resource. I would really encourage you to go and take a look through the web pages. Susie and my colleague Leanne DeLake is going to be back on in a second to talk about actually how you access some of this information, the kind of resources that are available. But I would like to just offer some sort of strategic reflections looking across the segments, and also maybe just offer some reflections on what we're hearing from the government today, because there's lots, I think, in Britain Talks Climate that is really helpful for helping us to infer how people will be responding to Boris's 10-point plan. And I think, firstly, there's some really strong signals in Britain Talks Climate that we need to, as a movement, a broad movement, we need to make sure we're not fighting the battles from 10 years ago. So you can see in what Susie's presented here, right across the segments, climate denialism as a sort of out and out position is really dwindling. There's a growing appetite that has grown through COVID-19 for a green recovery. And there's currently no sign or no obvious sign of those kinds of cultural war dynamics that we see really bedeviling other social issues, and that we can see in other countries as well. So, you know, if it used to be the case that climate change was perceived as something for the left, for young people, people living in urban areas, then that's no longer the case. I think we have really solid evidence here. You know, look at the high concern from Loyal Nationals. Slowly but surely that social mandate is growing. Look at the language that Boris Johnson used to introduce these new policies, a green industrial revolution. It's a big step forward. And I think, though there's much to do, we are starting to enter into a new era of climate politics. And there's something quite striking, I think, about how well climate concern is holding up through COVID-19 in 2020. So frontiers of public engagement are moving, I think. That's really where I see Britain Talks Climate as being useful and helpful, is to help us sort of deepen engagement and to really help to drive those frontiers forward. But clearly there are still some pretty big battles remaining. We know that high levels of concern, high levels of worry on their own are not enough to drive deeper engagement, whether that means more significant behaviour changes, or whether that means supporting more ambitious policies, which we need to go there. The backbone Conservatives, they're a kind of politically powerful segment, I think, but at the moment, they don't really engage well with the idea that we need to move away from a sort of high meat diet. That's problematic at the moment. We need to take that segment on a journey. The Loyal Nationals won't really support the petrol diesel phase out unless and until they really believe and can be reassured that it's financially accessible and fair. And that is a fair enough perspective that I think we all need to be really conscious of. And voting on climate change is still a kind of minority interest, really. It's just really the progressive activists that do that in any kind of large numbers. We've seen that the kind of sense of solidarity has grown this year, or it did initially, as COVID-19 broke out at the beginning of the year. But it started to slip back again, not quite as far as it was before the pandemic, but it is moving back in a negative direction. And so, especially amongst the dominant group amongst activists, the progressive activists, fatalism is a real risk. And so, visceral climate breakdown can't sustain us forever without some sense of sort of practical hope and signs of progress. So that age-old hope versus fear kind of motivational challenge is still very much with us and will remain so, I think. So I just wanted to offer some sort of clear messages, I think, for engaging across the whole of society in here. Firstly, green jobs, they're clearly popular across the segments. And support for the green recovery has grown over COVID-19, but there are some segments, the disengaged battlers, for example, who are, they're open, they're in principle keen, but they need convincing that these benefits will accrue to them rather than to other people. So I think probably top of the list for all of us, no matter where we work across the climate sector, is kind of making good on this rhetoric around green jobs. What do they look like? Who does these jobs? Showing visually and in our narratives, real people in real jobs who are already forming part of the transition. I think that's a kind of key message across the segments and for all of us. There's a crisis of trust, I think, which is bigger than climate change, but it speaks really profoundly to climate change public engagement, because we have a challenge in that we struggle for trusted voices right across different issues, including climate change. So whilst there are some really powerful stories to tell, I think, around the experience of climate impacts that people have had themselves now, or people who are already sort of in transition to green jobs, we really need to find and support and nurture those trusted messengers, because they're quite hard to come by at the moment. And without them, we are going to struggle to reach into the segments that are, I guess, less familiar, less typical for the climate movement. COP26 is on all of our horizons now, a year away. And in some senses, Susie spoke to this, it's a real litmus test for the climate movement, I think, because the people who hold the reins in many ways, the progressive activists, are likely to feel quite conflicted about kind of supporting a government that they don't support. But what's clear, I think, from the findings in Britain Talks Climate is that the progressive activists can't do this alone. They're different from the other segments in lots of important ways. So that means we do need to bring other people with us on that journey. There shouldn't be a kind of single definition of what it means to belong to the climate movement, and we need diverse organisations right across the country, mobilising right across the segments in the run-up to COP, campaigning in surround sound, even if we don't have exactly the same message, which wouldn't be appropriate. So that's not, I think, an argument for going beyond politics, but it is an argument for kind of political pluralism. It's not an argument for collapsing everything into the middle, where nobody's offended, but nobody's really mobilised or energised. There are real tensions, I think, that the Britain Talks Climate resource points to, and we don't want to hand wave those away. Many people would see climate change first and foremost as an issue of justice or an issue of racial justice, but several of the segments certainly wouldn't recognise that starting point and that assumption. Nuclear power was in the Prime Minister's announcement. That will rear its ugly head again and be controversial, as it always has been, for good reason, if it starts to be in the spotlight again. So perspectives won't always be reconcilable, but I think it's important to recognise that finding common ground doesn't mean kind of always going through the centre or ignoring differences. I think it's quite the opposite. We want to understand the different perspectives that people have, so that we can start to best of our abilities from where they are, and find commonalities that might not be obvious otherwise. For example, the Loyal Nationals' lived experience now of British climate impacts and seeing changes in the weather around us, is a very different starting point for a kind of communication strategy than winning an argument about acting on climate. They're very, very different things. So just to wrap up before I hand back to Susie and then Leanne, we see really clearly across the segments that there's no desire to go back to normal. That's clear across the segments, and the UK has the highest agreement with this kind of sentiment in Europe. So obviously lots of people, lots of us in lots of different ways were not happy with how things were before the pandemic, and COVID-19 has really exposed a lot of inequalities more than ever. So questions about jobs, but I think more broadly, what kind of society do we want, are really front of mind in a way that they weren't a year ago. And if the climate movement can position ourselves with answers to these questions within this new context, and as opportunities for transformations, then we can make them catalyzed by broad public buy-in, rather than positioning them as sort of fighting against the grain of public opinion. Okay, so I'm going to pass back over to Susie and Leanne now for some of the more practical sides of this resource.
Thanks, Adam. All right, so I have one more slide before I pass on to Leanne. And so as part of this project, we've created a series of resources that can help people apply what we found. So one obvious one is the toolkit. So Leanne will give you a walkthrough of our brilliant toolkit. It's on the website, and there are also downloadable resources such as prompts for team discussions within organizations on how to engage particular segments and how to sort of challenge assumptions. We also have provided golden questions, where there are 16 questions that YouGov developed for us that allow you to segment the people that you're speaking to, for instance, or even yourselves, and you can see where you fall, which segment you fall into. So there's the questions themselves. There's also a calculator, an Excel calculator, where you can paste in results from the survey and find out what percentage of your sample falls into which segment, and also a tutorial on the website as well. And we also have advice for conducting research online, for instance, through Facebook Chat Fuel or other ways. And in early 2021, we're also going to be adding some case studies that are currently underway with various organizations looking at digital message testing to reach particular segments. So I'm going to pass on to Leanne now, who I think will share her screen.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone see the lovely homepage of Britain Talks Climate? Susie, can you nod? Excellent, thank you. Hello, everyone. So my name is Leanne Deleg. I'm the communications lead at Climate Outreach, and I have the really fun job of taking you on a little tour of our brand new Britain Talks Climate online toolkit, where you'll be able to revisit and dive into some of the insights that you've been hearing from my colleagues, and importantly, access tools to be able to apply this to your own work. So where do you find Britain Talks Climate? On the homepage of our website, which is climateoutreach.org. So here we go. Here we are at the landing page of Britain Talks Climate. And what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of an overview of our homepage, which will show you the whole structure of the toolkit, and then dive into some of the pages. So a good place to start, but the nice thing with this toolkit is really you can kind of move between sections in the way that works for you. But a good place to start might be our summary, which has all of kind of the key insights, what Britain Talks Climate provides, an overview of the 7 segments, just a good place to start. Then as you move down the homepage, you have a section on the big picture. So some of the big themes that form a backdrop for Britain Talks Climate, trust, race, gender, wealth, common ground and differences on climate change across all the segments, and also what's changed with COVID-19. Then this section is probably where a lot of you will spend quite a bit of time as well. It's where we dive into the 7 segments in depth, and I will come back to that. And then, as Susie was just mentioning, a section on how do you put all of these insights into practice. And again, I will come back to that. And then at the very bottom of the home page, you have a section where you can download some of the information as PDF. All of the information is on these web pages, but if you'd like, you can also download the full report as well as a summary and the methodology. And just so you know, as you move through all of these different pages, you can always access the menu right here in this little sticky menu. So moving to here, I'm just going to show you this page. It's not potentially the aspect that has the most substance for you, but we did get a kick out of these, out of animating these little videos and bringing these icons to life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick randomly one of the segments. So I'll pick the Civic pragmatists, and I will show you what this page looks like. So each of the 7 segments follows the same structure, which means it's really easy to look across the various segments. So there's who are the segment, what do the civic pragmatists on climate change, how do they feel about certain policies, COVID-19, and also importantly, how do we engage these this segment. So if I click on that, it takes me to the exact spot on the page where that information is. So this a really key part of the toolkit, which I hope many of you will have a chance to look at, with some key takeaways on how we engage this segment. You can go back to the top of the page with this little arrow here, bottom right. And I'll just kind of just quickly take you through some of these features that hopefully will help you engage with these segments. So I'm already running a little bit out of time, I think. So I'm just going to go quickly on this, but again, you'll have plenty of time after the webinar, hopefully, to dive into these pages. But you've got quotes from the segments. You've got statistics that show you how they feel about certain policies. There's lots and lots of information here, which I hope you'll agree is presented in a really engaging format. And then just very, very quickly, I will show you this section where, as Susie was mentioning, golden questions for segmenting audiences. If I go to that, you'll see that the tools that Susie was mentioning are here. So you can download the golden questions as a PDF and also the calculator. And if this seems overwhelming at all, I also asked Susie to kindly create a little tutorial video which walks you through how to engage with the golden questions calculator and the golden questions PDF. Okay, so I hope this has been a quick tour, but again, hopefully enough to make you want to dive into all of this deeper. We have designed this toolkit in a way, in a way for you to be able to shape the national debate in a way that draws on shared values and avoids division. And we really hope to hear what you think about the resource. And I hope you enjoy exploring it. So thank you very much, and I will pass it back to Jessie.
Thanks, Leanne, and thank you to everyone for your really generous comments in the chat so far. We're going to take a quick break now, bang on the dot of 11:25, and we're going to come back at 11:30. Please submit any questions you want Susie and Adam to try and answer in the time we have in the Q&A function. And we will see you at 11:30. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I am going to do my very best to try and assimilate the 77 open questions we have. Apologies if we don't manage to come specifically to yours. I'm sure Adam and Susie will be happy to follow up with any areas that sort of go unanswered in the broad sweep of things. So first I'm going to come to Susie to answer some questions specifically about the segmentation. So there were a number of questions grouped around, like, how fixed are these categories? Under what circumstances might someone shift segment, if that's possible? Is there any risk of bias given these segments were constructed around participants' answers? And are you at all worried that this kind of segmentation could lead to stereotyping of different groups? So I'll just start with that one.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks for the question. I'll start with the stability and movement between the segments. So the core beliefs model and the psychographic variables that we used, such as people's values, are generally considered to be quite stable and don't really shift very much. So we don't expect very much shifting between segments in that, you know, someone will be this one day and this another day. But perhaps over a longer span of time, generationally, there will be a shift in the overall population and the balance of the segments within those. I hope that answers your question. In terms of the bias around self-report, well, I mean, yeah, these are surveys are usually limited by the fact that they are self-report, but we don't have any reason to expect that people are not being honest when answering these questions. And also the extensive interviews and focus groups that we conducted afterwards really sort of confirmed. Can people hear me? Yeah, okay. Really sort of confirmed that, sorry, I think I've lost the screen. Confirmed the responses from the initial survey. Yeah, so that's the second one about bias. And last one about stereotyping. Well, yeah, I think on this one, I mean, one thing that we've provided in this case is an overview of 7 perspectives in the UK, and obviously there are more than 7 perspectives in general, but not all, you know, all models need to balance simplicity and usefulness. And in this case, we have we've come up with a way of finding 7 major different perspectives that are perhaps simplifications in some sense, but they provide more nuance than other methods that we've traditionally used in looking at climate change attitudes in the UK. And it's, yeah, I think that hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Susie. And I think it's worth saying that we consulted kind of people across the sort of political spectrum and lots of different disciplines to try and get at kind of segment names that felt, you know, representative of those groups and were, you know, not sort of pejorative or anyway, or had carried negative connotation. So Susie, I'm actually going to come back to you just on this issue around demographics. Lots of people have been asking whether there are biases in age, gender, ethnicity, region and religion. So I wonder if you can sort of answer those all together for me.
Thanks, Jessie. Yes, okay, so I think on gender, we had the Civic pragmatists, so the pink segment. Maybe I can go back. Can people still see my slides? No, okay. Well, okay, we have the Civic pragmatists who were, I think, 12% above the mean in female over male respondents. For the disengaged traditionalists, I think they were about 10% above the mean, more likely to be men. But I think also, as we talked about earlier with ethnicity, people from the disengaged battlers segment and progressive activist segment were slightly more likely to be from ethnic minorities, and they were less likely to be represented in loyal nationals and backbone conservative segments. And age in general, we had So I talked about some segments as being younger and some as being older, but really we had representation on all segments from people of all ages, but the averages differed. So the progressive activists and the disengaged battlers trended towards younger, but I think the average age was still something like 42, whereas the other segments, such as the loyal nationals, trended towards being older, but then again, the average was, I can't remember exactly what it was, maybe high 40s, low 50s. So age was, there are shifts, but they are represented across all segments. And yeah, I think hopefully that works. And and I can also talk about maybe politics and voting. So there were a couple of segments that were characterized by a high percentage of people who would vote Labour or vote Conservative. So I think progressive activists are more likely to vote Labour. Background conservatives more likely to vote Conservative, but then the lines are not quite so clear cut for the other segments. So I think you can probably see this in the toolkit. Yeah.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, and the profiles online will give you much more information about the sort of demographic spread of each of these segments. Adam, I'm going to come to you next, because some people have been asking whether there is comparable research like this, particularly in the US and Australia, where we know it's a slightly different debate, and maybe also parts of Europe.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's interesting to hear the questions and the conversation around, the risks of sort of simplifying and, stereotyping and making distinctions. I think if this, if this model is a simplification, it's quite a sophisticated one, and it's one that does capture quite a lot of meaningful differences between people. And so, in that sense, there isn't, I don't think, anything else quite like this, in terms of a climate resource and toolkit in other countries. Certainly our partners more in common have been working successfully to use exactly this model, the core beliefs model, to segment national populations in the US, in the European level as well. But I think I would say there is, a real opportunity here, especially seeing what seems to be the the appetite for a really practical resource like this that can help people campaign, can help people reach out beyond the usual suspects. And I think it does kind of offer a model that we can and should be looking to develop elsewhere, because the same or at least analogous challenges are in other countries that we face in Britain. There are very good analyses of different audiences in terms of their climate perceptions in other countries. Australia and America and Canada have developed a sort of 6 Americas model, 5 Canadas model. It's a bit different though. It's more about people's level of sort of skepticism about climate change, their level of concern, and using those ratings of climate perceptions to divide people up. Whereas what this does is gets, I would say, a kind of a few levels lower down and gets in at the level of sort of values and identity and institutional trust and all the factors that go into that core beliefs model to produce something that does stand up over time, I think, and is a bit more resilient, and you can plug different kind of campaign goals and objectives into.
Thanks, Adam. That's very useful. Susie, back to you. Some people have been wondering how we can communicate about issues that are perhaps a bit more divisive and could lead to quite a strong reaction within some of the segments, but which are, very important to the agenda. So I'm thinking in particular, framing the climate crisis as a racial injustice issue. How would you advise people approach that problem?
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, this is a really tricky one, and I don't think there is an easy answer to this. It's a very important issue also to me personally, but so what we found is that while people generally feel that climate change is an issue for all, and in some senses that's a good thing, there's also a low understanding right now of how climate change can affect people from different from Black communities, from ethnic minority communities, from Indigenous communities more. So that's quite low in understanding. It's an issue where really only progressive activists are sort of out on their own on this, and even not the majority of progressive activists, I think. So the main thing is at this point that we need to be careful about going forward and communicating in a unifying way to bring as many people as possible on board. So another thing to note is that the loyal nationals particularly will be resistant to messages like this.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, I think we're in the early stages, aren't we, of understanding how to move forward with issues like that. And it's going to take some careful work over the next few years. Adam, there have been lots of questions around what you do if you have a room full of people who come from all of these different segments. And I guess part of the answer is, like, what are the messages that have really broad appeal? You mentioned green jobs, but are there others that are a kind of safe entry point for talking to everyone across the population? And how do you, I guess, avoid going into those spaces where you may have quite a mixed group and saying something that could kind of inadvertently alienate someone?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good. I really like the phrasing of that question. The kind of a room full of people all across these different segments, and how do you go about that kind of situation? And I think something that we say often at Climate Outreach, and it's important to bear in mind, is, you know, it's a lot to do with process, and there aren't any magic words that you can say that will, you know, please everyone, or that, you know, might not or that will work for everyone, you know, consistently. But there are definitely better and worse ways of, you know, starting climate conversations. And I think what's in the Britain Towards Climate resource builds on what we already understand about climate engagement, is that there are certain kind of values and perspectives that are pretty widely shared. So, you know, yesterday's announcement, this morning's announcement, focused on insulating people's homes again as one of the points of the 10-point plan. And on some level, it's, you know, very much a win-win kind of policy. People save money, you know, and they save carbon as well. But we've seen these things founder and fail before because they haven't paid attention to the kind of things that people are weighing up when they have this kind of, when they approach this kind of policy. It's not just an economic judgment. It's about, you know, how they feel about their home. So avoiding wastefulness and saving energy is a good starting point. But when you're moving forward to what that looks like as a policy, it's being kind of sensitive, I think, to those softer elements of how people make decisions. I mean, other areas where people have got things in common, I mean, avoiding wastefulness, that's really common across the segments. Kind of ending our throwaway society, that's also a kind of really, really popular sentiment. I think in different ways, and this has been something that is changed in a positive direction through COVID-19. People engage with, you know, green spaces in a rural way and in an urban way more positively now than maybe they did a year ago. So I think, you know, messages around protecting nature are pretty uncontroversial. And there was another question in the chat that links to this, I think, which is kind of, you know, engagement in local areas. And I think that again that's a way to bring people together. I think those people in a room, they might have different, you know, perspectives from a segment point of view, but if they're all from the same town, they're all from the same geographical constituency, then there's a sort of place-based way of finding common ground in there potentially as well.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Adam. Susie, probably one of the final ones for you, but to what extent does income drive participation in low carbon behaviours? Do you see any kind of patterns in behaviour that might speak to that point? And in your opinion, do people tend to view action on climate as something that they have to sacrifice personally for? How do they see that?
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, the question about income, I think we can see that quite clearly with the two disengaged groups. They tend to be on average lower earning, and for instance, the disengaged battlers care about climate change, but their engagement is the second lowest, and that's after the disengaged traditionalists. So there is an element of accessibility of certain actions being even possible or relevant to particular segments. So yeah, I think also recently there's been in the media some things about the very small percentage of people who fly, for instance, that often doesn't apply to lower income segments. But at the same time, it's not just about income. So we can see with the Loyal Nationals, they're also a low income group, but they're more willing to support British farmers, for instance, because of their sort of more concern about climate change, but also values supporting yeah, supporting local industry, supporting local farmers. And sorry, the second question, could you repeat that, please?
Oh, it was around self-sacrifice and whether or not people see it in those terms.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think that's not really something that we looked at quite so directly here. We did see that across the segments, a lot of people were willing to make changes to their personal lives on climate change. And I think part of our recommendations are to sort of emphasize that in this project and also elsewhere is that your engagement on climate change can be about your personal lifestyles. It can also be your political activities. It can be talking to your family and friends and your community. It doesn't have to be about sacrifice in that sense.
Thanks, Susie. Adam, two more for you. So one is around language. There have been a few questions coming through on how we talk about things like co-benefits of action on climate in sort of more down-to-earth ways. And also how we talk about urgency. You know, there is a high degree of sort of fatalism in some of these segments. How do we talk about the need for urgent action in a way that, you know, doesn't exacerbate a sort of crisis in personal agency? And then, I guess somewhat connected to that, a lot of people are wondering about messengers and just how important it is to get the messenger right for each of these segments. Who do you see as the heroes in talking to each of these segments, and do we have enough of them?
Yes, good questions. So in terms of language, there's, you know, we at Climate Outreach and others in this space, we do a lot of this kind of work, and not just on language, on imagery as well, where we're essentially saying, let's test out different narratives, whether they're language or visual, and see what engages different audiences. And there are things that we can, you know, that we can point to that we do think engage either specific groups, say with, you know, more kind of centre right leaning audiences around keeping things in balance, you know, making kind of practical common sense decisions, or things that we think engage well across the whole of society. And one lens for that has become even more prominent is around health. Health is an interesting one because, you know, we all have health and experience our health in a way that we, even now climate change has become closer to home, don't quite experience climate change in that way. We sort of know that the level of the baseline level of understanding about climate change as a health issue is quite low, but the potential is there to engage on climate change through a kind of health lens, and explaining how climate impacts negatively affect people's health, the very old or the very young in a heat wave, or people's mental health through flooding, but also how kind of, you know, low carbon solutions can improve health as well through insulating drafty homes or whatever that might be. And this speaks, I think, to the messenger question as well. Climate scientists are well trusted, but health professionals are well trusted as well. You know, for a sort of a comparable but distinct set of reasons. And there's every opportunity, I think, to work through health networks and health professionals to articulate what climate change means in a way that just slightly repositions it away from that environmentalist lens, which is typically had, and which is one of the ways to think about climate change, but certainly not the only way. I mean, always in terms of language as well, if we're thinking at the local level, just, I mean, listen to how people say things in their own words for the clues as to how to engage. I think that's really important, and it is something that comes through time after time in the resources that we put out. We've got a kind of guide, talking climate guide to engaging, having community conversations, and listening is a huge part of it, paying attention to how people articulate things themselves. Yeah, and the question about the need for more trusted messengers and heroes, I'm not gonna kind of name three people that we should be looking to. We can see some favourites coming through in the Britain Talks climate work, and people like David Attenborough kind of consistently pointed to as trusted messengers. But I think fundamentally this is about approaching it as a question of really finding authentic voices, and that's not something that you can be too prescriptive about. You need to actually go through a process, say, who are these people? Why do they really buy into it? And how are they part of a particular community? And work with them, not as a kind of conduit in an instrumental way to pass on a message, but as someone who really can articulate a message authentically and credibly, from their own values to their own segment. So I think sometimes it's about taking ourselves off the microphone, moving ourselves off the stage a bit if we're campaigners and strategists, and really giving space to those other voices to be the mouthpiece for climate change in a way that maybe we haven't done as much as we could have done yet.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, 2 final questions. The first for you, Susie, which is that we obviously have a really diverse group listening in here today, which is absolutely fantastic. So people have been asking, who's this resource for? Is it for businesses as well as green groups and a whole kind of gamut of other kind of sectors? And can it be applied to different disciplines? We've got kind of psychologists online, behavioral scientists, how can we kind of apply these insights across disciplines, which we also need to kind of draw into our communications?
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, so I guess the answer to that is that this resource is for anyone or any organization hoping to engage broader audiences on climate change, regardless of what organization they come from, or also people who want to have an understanding of different British views on climate change. So not only the climate NGO space, but other organizations, and we've been also working with different organizations to sort of broaden our reach. We've had contact with political groups, academics, local councillors, definitely businesses. And I think this, while a lot of this is based in social science, it's not necessarily restricted to one discipline. And yeah, we're definitely already reaching across disciplines in this sense, in the analysis, in a lot of our, in many aspects of this work. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Brilliant, thanks, Susie. And Adam, finally for you, what are the implications for radical action of this work and radical voices on climate?
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is an appetite for it that's grown over the last few years as well. I mean, there's the success of the school strikes, actions and Extinction Rebellion in ringing the alarm bell and really building the sort of salience of how urgent climate change is reflected in. It's a long-term trend, but it's reflected in where we see public polling now. We, going into the end of 2019, we were reaching historic highs in terms of levels of public concern, levels of agreement that climate change is an emergency, and levels of agreement that climate change is happening in the here and now. So that kind of psychological distance disappearing, or at least reducing. And that's continued into 2020. We still see those really high levels of concern. So what is that? I think it's a starting point for public engagement. It's where we need to be, perhaps a little later than we would have wanted to be. And I think announcements such as we've heard from the UK government today are a similar kind of thing. They're a starting point and a starting line, but really with a lot of the hard work still to do. So yeah, some of the segments, the more engaged segments are already ready for radical action, and they're raring to go. For them, the message is that you've got to bring other people with you. And to do that, you have to take them on a journey. You have to start from what you know about them, what you understand about them, which you can see in Britain towards climate. And for the other segments, I think the in principle enthusiasm is there, but it needs to be presented in a way that resonates with their values. That can be seen to be fair, that is in an inclusive way, and that leads people from from where they are to ultimately where we all need to be on climate change.
Wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Adam and Susie, very much. I think we better leave the questions there for now. Thank you for some really thoughtful and challenging questions and insights. A lot of food for thought for me and for the whole Britain Talks Climate team. I'm going to hand over to Joel Silver, who is the partnerships lead at Climate Outreach, and then we will finish with a quick more like a sort of live poll, and wrap up at midday. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Jessie, and hi everyone. So I'm Joel, I'm a partnerships lead at Climate Outreach, and I'm just taking a couple of minutes here towards the end of the webinar to share with you a bit more info about how Climate Outreach can support yourselves, anyone listening, and organisations to use Britain Towards Climate in your activities, and also just quickly cover some of our own plans for 2021 and beyond. So it's safe to say we're really excited to finally be able to share the Britain Towards Climate work with you. And we are just delighted at all the engagement here and how many of you have chosen to attend the webinar. Really appreciate your time. Also, don't, apologies if we didn't get your question. We had literally hundreds of questions and the engagement has been fantastic. So thank you very much for that. The project has been 2 years in the making, and I'd like to thank all the funders and partners who helped make the project happen, particularly the European Climate Foundation. So many of you, I'm sure, will be sitting there thinking, how can I utilize these insights, apply them to my organization, my campaigns and audiences? For those of you who are seeking further insight from the Britain Towards Climate data and evidence, especially those tailored to specific audiences and communication routes, we at Climate Outreach are really keen to hear from organizations and individuals who are interested in commissioning Climate Outreach to work with yourselves on embedding these insights into your communications. That can include training workshops, advising on the design of communication strategies and plans, helping to build and test framing, messaging, narratives and visuals. And as the next stage of the Britain Talks Climate project, we've also really pleased to have a bit of limited capacity to specifically support civil society organisations in implementing the findings through our new engagement lab, which is initially going to be focused on groups working on engaging the public in the run-up to COP26, the Glasgow Climate Conference. You can read more about what we have to offer on that front in the services section of our website. You just click the link at the top. So the model we've followed for Britain Towards Climate follows that of our other projects, in that we aim to basically release all of our resources and tools for free to yourselves, to the climate community, to the wider public, to fulfill our charitable goal, Climate Outreach's charitable goal of creating the public mandate for climate action. Being a charity, we do of course rely on donations from individuals, groups and foundations. Amazing projects like what you've seen today, they don't just happen. They start as an internal idea or suggestion, they build momentum, they're built into our strategy before going on a long journey to turn into the sort of powerful and unique resources and insights like Britain Towards Climate. In order to continue to provide vital guidance like this and develop our next major project, Climate Outreach is in need of further philanthropic funding. Firstly, to cover our core costs that keep us going on a monthly basis, and secondly, to build on the success of the Britain Towards Climate project. Specifically, we're currently looking to build up our understanding of the run-up to COP26, and also we are in the process of looking how we can replicate and roll out the Britain Towards Climate model internationally. So if you're interested in supporting us or working with us, we would love to hear from you. You'll see on the email address on the screen here on the slide. If you want to get in touch with us about anything I've just mentioned, partnerships, commissioning us to do work, funding, or indeed the engagement lab itself, please do get in touch with us. That's britain-talks-climate@climateoutreach.org. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. With just 2 minutes to spare, I really hope you can all stay on and just participate in this live poll that we planned, which is designed to kind of show us where we currently are in engaging these segments and where we hope to be. So you should see the poll up on your screen right now. If you could respond to that live, that would be great. Okay, it's bang on 12, so it's clear to everyone who can see the poll, but we're all currently engaging, mostly the segments that you would expect, who are kind of slightly to the left of centre on or quite far to the left of centre on social and cultural issues, and for whom this is climate change is a big priority. And where we hope to get to is a much more balanced picture, and one that I personally find very, very heartening. So thank you very much for participating in that and for joining us today. And I just want to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers. I hope you found it useful, and we will be sending out a very short feedback form in the next couple of days, which we would love to get your thoughts on, so we can continue to improve these webinars and take some of your feedback into improving the Britain Talks Climate Toolkit. Thank you very, very much, and have a good day.